Encryption keeps millions of people across the world safe, and it's doing that every day.
Millions of Ukrainians have downloaded end-to-end encrypted apps to message loved ones and share their stories with the world.
Safety is the most important thing for Ukrainians.
Encryption is playing a key role in keeping women safe when their reproductive rights are being eroded.
Encryption is safety.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning. Seems like we are having a small technical issue. We're waiting for our host to join. So if you can give us a couple of minutes, she will be here pretty soon. Thank you. While we're waiting for her to join us, I will give you some housekeeping rules about the event today. We're hosting this on Zoom webinar. It means only panelists will be on screen and everyone who's on the audience will not be able to speak or to be on camera for this event. Chat is working though, so on the right-hand side of your screen, you're able to talk to everyone, send questions to panelists, and comment on the content that you're hearing as part of the event. We do have Q&A also available, so if you have questions for the panelists, please make sure to add them in there. We have the content of this session will be delivered in English, but we do have simultaneous interpretation in Spanish and French. So if you want to listen to Spanish or French, you can click on the interpretation icon that you see on the bottom of your screen. It's a small globe. We also have closed captioning in English, Spanish, and French. So I will drop a note later on with the code that you also can use to see all of those languages. I believe that Shital should be back right now, so we'll be able to start pretty soon with the panel. Okay,
Hi,
I think
everyone.
we're on.
Yeah, thank you,
Okay,
Raquel.
thank
Thanks
you. All good.
Okay, great. I hope you can hear and see me all right.
Yes.
Thank you for doing the housekeeping. So welcome, everyone. My name is Sheetal Kumar, and I represent Global Partners Digital on the Global Encryption Coalition Steering Committee. And it's my pleasure to be here with you and to moderate this discussion, which is the final one in our summit today on encryption for all, safeguarding communications in vulnerable populations. So we have lost a little bit of time. I'm sorry about my connection issues earlier, and thanks again to Raquel for holding the ship there. So I do want to move us to the discussion with our panelists today, who I'll introduce in a bit. But just to give you a bit of context for this discussion, we all know that encryption is integral to safe and secure communications for all, but particularly for those who are historically marginalized and vulnerable. And yet we don't often hear, or we don't hear as much as we should from these communities about their lived experiences of using secure messaging apps, which is very important, of course, hearing from them and understanding what those lived experiences are in ensuring that secure messaging is in fact trustworthy. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to shine some light on the research that has been done by researchers who've worked to bring to light the lived experiences of users, vulnerable users of secure and private messaging apps. And in doing so, ensure power to the people, particularly those who are the most vulnerable. And I'm very happy to say that we have 3 panelists here who are able to support us in that endeavor. I will introduce them and then move straight to them. So we have here on our panel Caroline Sinders, who is founder of Human Rights and Design Lab, Convocation Research and Design. Welcome, Caroline. We also have Diana Gheorghiu, who is Legal and Policy Officer at Child Rights International Network, or CRIN, and who also leads CRIN's work on digital rights, children's rights in the digital environment. And we also have Robert Fabricant, who is the co-founder of Dalberg's Design Impact Group. So as I said, they've all done research on how encryption is being used by marginalized or vulnerable groups, and will be sharing their insights with us from that research in the first part of our panel. And then we'll be discussing how we build on that research and take it forward as researchers and activists to ensure that secure messaging is as secure as it can be. So we are going to start with Caroline. You co-wrote a report which looked at how people, including vulnerable populations such as those in war zones, so seeking reproductive health care in areas where that is criminalized, use secure messaging apps, which are communications apps that are either completely or partly encrypted. What did you find, and what do your findings mean for vulnerable users and for those who design and provide encrypted services?
For sure. Thank you so much for that question. So these two different, we looked at 2 different groups. One group was journalists in India who were facing all different kinds of sort of governmental threats. And then another group was reproductive justice activists in the American South, where abortion is now banned. What was interesting in terms of sort of comparing and working with these 2 groups is they have similar needs, but very different, let's say, backgrounds in terms of approaching the problem. So journalists we were working with had quite a bit of a background and knowledge in terms of how, let's say, like different kinds of cyber attacks and cyber threats worked and how they were sort of targeting them. Their issue, or some of the issues they were facing, were what are some of the ways to create different kinds of safe documentation, for example. So paper trails are being needed for different kinds of work and research that they're doing. So some of the bigger issues in that case was, how do you create like a secure pipeline of working from, let's say, taking photos, from doing interviews, from being able to be reachable, but also, again, really ensuring that those comms are end-to-end encrypted and secure, but again, also creating a way in which information, let's say, could be somewhat archived or be able to be reproduced at later dates. Conversely, the groups we were working with in the American South were extremely new to technology and to encryption. They were facing, a lot of them don't have backgrounds in tech. They actually work way, way outside of technology. And this is something that they're doing within their communities, within different kinds of community organizations, be them sort of ad hoc activist groups to ones that are slightly more, let's say, like codified or more established along recognized reproductive groups, for example. And so within that, a lot of our work was also trying to help unpack and explain different conceptions and misconceptions of technology, of what is encryption, of where is it, of how do you access it. In that case, what they were most concerned about was information getting out. So not necessarily creating a paper trail, but the exact opposite. And in fact, what we ended up covering more in that with them was what are ways to build pipelines and ways to work to ensure that information is not leaving the specific groups that they're in, but then also where does, let's say, encryption stop in the messaging app, and where does digital hygiene and different kinds of security training sort of come in to help impact how they're using tools. And a lot of this ended up being sort of tied into digital literacy. One of the reasons this is really important is, at least in the United States, the American South does get quite a bit overlooked in terms of tech policy and tech literacy and tech education. And so we were able to provide all different kinds of trainings to sort of unpack, how do different kinds of messaging apps work? How do different aspects of privacy and security on their phone work? How can that impact them? What are the ways for them to be incredibly safe? And, this is a very real threat model. And this was during a time where I'm sure some of y'all are aware of this, at least in the US, a Nebraska mother and daughter who had been trying to seek reproductive health care and an abortion have been using Facebook Messenger, and that their messages had been turned over by Meta to law enforcement, leading to them facing jail time. And this is obviously a very real threat for people in the American South and also all across the US where abortion is banned. And there is sort of the weight of criminality hanging on top of activists. So in this case, our biggest thing was trying to destigmatize different kinds of apps. We talked a little bit about WhatsApp and actually how it can be safe. People had a lot of skepticism using it because of its ties to Meta. Other things that were sort of really interesting that popped out were the different activists we were working with had heard that Signal was good, but had sort of no real tooling or ways to sort of verify why is it good, why is it safe, what does good mean in this context. And so there's not a lot necessarily in the app that can sort of show you or tell you that. This user group understood that encryption was necessary and what was needed in terms of safety, but it was helping building blocks around what does encryption mean towards safety, what does it do, and again trying to help them create sort of holistic plans in terms of security and privacy, obviously built on top of encryption to be as safe as possible. So, it is very much like a foundational element of, I would argue, anyone's digital hygiene, as Matt Mitchell, security trainer, has sort of named, but just in our sort of general safe practices, sort of regardless of your threat model, encryption and encryption is this necessary infrastructure, if you will, of our communication. We uncovered a lot of different things within our report that we can get into later, but some of the bigger issues were sort of pointing out in other apps that we recommended our user groups not use, such as like Telegram and Facebook Messenger, that encryption is not necessarily in those cases automatically turned on, nor necessarily like end-to-end encrypted, and how that can sort of serve different kinds of threats to them that you could think you're having, let's say, a very secure or, again, encrypted chat, and not necessarily, because the UI and the actual sort of infrastructural, like UX design of those products are really, really working against you.
Thanks, Caroline. It was that's really interesting to hear, and we can put the research in the chat as well, the report, because it's it's, as I think you've been speaking to, really important to note the wider ecosystem and context in which vulnerable users use messaging apps, which they may think are private or secure, or they may have misconceptions or certain concerns that the app itself cannot allay, and therefore there is that need for digital literacy and at least an understanding of those threats, those concerns, and that really impacts whether or not the use of the app for communications is in fact secure. So thank you for that. We'll delve into it in a bit more detail, that research. Also, when we've heard from Diana and Robert, which actually brings me to Diana. You worked within CRIN, or CRIN co-authored a report which was published earlier this year that aimed to capture the full complexity of how encryption affects children's lives. It sets out principles for an approach to encryption that is holistic, that recognizes and respects that full range of their rights. And we've actually heard a bit earlier in other sessions about that, which we can try and bring into this discussion here as well. But before we do that, I'll turn over to you. Could you present us with a brief overview of the findings in your report? Thank you, Diana.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Sheetal, and for the invitation to speak about our work. So yes, in January, Child Rights International Network, CRIN, in collaboration with Defend Digital Me, launched the report Privacy and Protection, a Children's Rights Approach to Encryption. It was our response to the very strong polarization emerging in discussions around children's rights online, particularly regarding encryption and child sexual abuse. We had conversations with a full range of experts working on this issue: child protection, children's rights, digital rights, privacy and data protection, internet regulation, and the technology industry. And we found that there is a lot more common ground in the debate that perhaps is recognized, but as one interviewee put it, is the details where it gets tricky. So in order to systematize and analyze these details, we identified and applied a framework to the conversation, and this is the children's rights approach. So we treated the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child as an agreed international framework that covers the full range of children's rights. We examined how the application of encryption can pose both benefits and risks to these rights, and we argued that children, their rights, their interests are on all sides of the discourse. And in particular, three arguments. First, that children are fully formed subjects of rights, including privacy, and that privacy is a key right for children's development because it allows them to shape their personalities and to find out who they are. The second argument is that privacy versus protection. The existing polarization is a false dilemma, because it's not the case that encryption poses only benefits for privacy and only risks for the protection of children. So, for example, encrypted channels can be used to circulate child sexual abuse material, which violates the privacy of victims. On the other hand, encrypted channels can also be used to seek help where children are victims of violence. So, for example, perpetrated by a family member. So it's not privacy versus protection, it's privacy and protection, and even that privacy and protection can feel reductive because, in fact, encryption engages not only children's rights to privacy and protection from violence, but also non-discrimination, the right to life, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, the right to health, and even, as we saw, the protection of children affected by armed conflict. So we used hypothetical scenarios. Our scenarios are hypothetical in order to show that the impact of encryption, whether positive or negative, varies significantly, depending on children's backgrounds, needs, identities. And through these hypothetical scenarios, we also aimed to showcase an aspect which has received less attention in the debate, and that is children's agency, their ability to make decisions and to exercise their rights, especially where these children come from disadvantaged or marginalized groups. So in relation to the state, for example, we looked at the benefits of encryption for children who are politically active under repressive regimes, children whistleblowers and activists, children who want to make decisions about their own body, as we saw, for example, regarding abortion, and children whose rights are restricted under general human rights law. So for instance, under states of emergency in times of conflict, or for the protection of national security. In relation to the family, we focused on scenarios of children whose interests or views are different from those of their parents. So for example, LGBT plus children who come from culturally conservative families. And also, for example, children who might be put at a disadvantage because of their parents' status. So children of HIV positive parents who are identified and discriminated against. But of course, as we said, encryption could also pose risks to marginalized children. So in relation to platforms, for example, we focused on children from ethnic minority groups who could be targeted by hate speech on encrypted channels. So overall, the debate is very complex, and we chose to be non-restrictive about the ways in which approaches to encryption can be child rights compliant. We set out 10 principles, and I just want to leave you with 2 of these principles. First, the ecosystem principle. So we argue that encryption should not be the starting point in debates around societal problems affecting children, for example, online child sexual abuse. Instead, policymakers should identify the policy goal first, that is to be achieved, and then consider the range of options, which could be of a technological nature or not, that could be implemented in order to achieve that policy goal. And the other important principle is the no general ban on encryption principle. So we argue that if encryption were removed from all services that children use, far from protecting them, this would leave them vulnerable to a wide range of exploitation and abuse. And it is possible to regulate the applications of encryption, but this must be consistent with children's rights. Thank you.
Really great. Thank you for that, Diana. And I think what we were hoping to bring with this panel is really nuance in what can often be quite a binary discussion or what feels like going around in circles. And to break that, we wanted to really ensure that we're talking about that nuance that you brought there with the research, the point about the role that encryption plays or how it's experienced by children really depends on such a range of factors, including context, needs, identities. And with those really concrete recommendations at the end, I think a very helpful path forward as well for both discussion and consideration of how to then build on that research. Thank you. I will now move to Robert. Robert, you worked with researchers and with advocates from the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Lab, the Stanford Internet Observatory, Tech Policy Press, and Hackers, to understand the lived experiences of users of private messaging platforms. And this confirmed the pervasive role of peer-to-peer messaging in communications, for critical to access and to share critical information. Can you tell us a bit more about that research and specifically what users and designers of these services should be aware of?
Yeah, so thank you. Apologies, there's a little background noise where I am. It's a birthday, so wasn't anticipating that. But yeah, the research we did was pretty broad-based. And it was pretty broad-based because we were trying to bring diverse people to the table. And as part of that, we were looking more broadly at trust, not necessarily specifically at the role of encryption. And the first thing I want to say, because I think it's critical, is when we get into these spaces of these conversations, we're talking about vulnerable groups, et cetera, marginalized groups. Sometimes we can lean into a narrative in which we view them as having less ability or less resourcefulness in how they engage with these platforms. And that's the first thing I wanted to say as someone who's been working and doing research around messaging platforms for 12, 15 years across the world. There's incredible resourcefulness, incredible intelligence in how these things are used, even if it doesn't always meet a certain bar of digital literacy in terms of understanding what encryption is. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, because we spoke to broad mass market users in places like Nigeria and Colombia. We also spoke to very specific individuals with specific risk profiles, whether they're mental health counselors, whether they're activists, whether they're trans folks. So it was a broad mix with a lot of very diverse voices and people with specific risks were well represented, overrepresented in those groups. And the one thing I wanted to say is these are people really trusting. So statements about encryption, things that are built into platforms are not things that they naturally always trust, number one. And number two, what they do share is different levels of dependence, where platforms, particularly WhatsApp, are critical to their livelihoods. So their risk profile is driven partly by kind of the particular trust and security issues they might run into and the particular areas of concern they have, but it's also relative to often higher levels of dependence. And that makes migrating off these platforms, particularly dominant ones like WhatsApp, very challenging. So the first thing I want to say is that encryption does not equate a sense of trust or safety at all. That is not, I don't think that's a messaging problem. I think that's a fundamental truth. And part of that is also the changing nature of messaging platforms, particularly private ones, which is they're acting a little more like social media. The group environments are changing rapidly and destabilizing a mental model that was driven by text messaging. And so in that sense, people are feeling unease generally. And while where that unease is coming from has a strong cultural component, there are definitely some common challenges. So just highlighting a few of those, and then I will pop a link into the materials that we developed in terms of some of the principles and even design ideas that could address them. The first is that there is this high level of dependence. People feel, and it means that people, even as they face risk, are likely to come back to platforms like WhatsApp. It means that even if there's stronger encryption behind the scenes, they're going to still feel a need to do something directly themselves to increase their safety. So we spoke to somebody who goes into airplane mode when they're reviewing messages so that their read unread status is not clear. So people are still going to need to do those things. And that gets back to a second challenge, which is there's a lot of missing feedback and recourse in terms of what's happening, ways I can understand the changing safety environment for me within a group as the group composition changes, understand the practices and principles behind the moderator and what they will and won't do within that group. So there's a lot of feedback missing. And my great fear is, number one, that encryption does make it more challenging at times to surface information for good reason, but it does. And second is that the platform providers are sitting behind that wall and saying, because of encryption, there's very little they can do to provide or should do to provide feedback to people and to give them clear recourse in situations that are now effectively behind a closed wall. So these dynamics are very hard for people to navigate as individuals. And it's creating a lot of day-to-day stress and pressure. And ultimately, in addition to safety and trust concerns, there are massive mental health concerns that came through our research, both from parents, individuals, young people, activists, et cetera. And most of the steps they took, they were only able to take temporarily. And eventually, partly because of the dominance of the platforms and the multiple ways they're using them, started to default back to behavior that from a trust and security perspective, they in some cases knew was probably not in their best interest.
Very interesting. Thanks, Robert. Sorry, did you want to add there? No. Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. I think that's given us a really good basis to move forward with the second part of our discussion, which is where do we go from here? And as Robin Wilton in the chat has pointed to, there is a common thread. There were a few in the interventions just there. But one of those is that there is a resourcefulness and an agency of users that is often forgotten, perhaps by those who are seeking to or who are regulating the use of these platforms, but also those who design them. And what that means in terms of the actual uses that what you see when you do dig in deeper, as you've done with the research, is that there are ways that users will work around the issues that they are confronted with, but that doesn't mean that they feel more at ease or they feel like their use of these apps are actually providing them with secure platforms for communication. And so I think what you pointed to there was the need for more transparency and perhaps some some new and different design choices to empower users and to not see them as needing as objects that need protection so much, but as these resourceful agents who can be empowered. So I want to ask if you have any particular recommendations for that, for empowering users and for ensuring better design. I know, Caroline, you spoke to the finding that users of messaging apps weren't sure or clear on exactly how much security they had. They weren't sure where to find that information. The apps, is that something that we can perhaps think of a recommendation to change that? Or are there any other specific recommendations you would have for both designers and others of these services to consider building on the research? I'll look to see if anybody in particular wants to take that. Is there any of the, yes, Caroline, go over to you.
Great, yeah, so actually at the end of our paper, we have an entire section on recommendations for like users, developers, and designers as well. One of the biggest things for us is, so we didn't really focus on trust, for example, in our report. Instead, what we ended up focusing a lot on safety and what safety felt like and was defined by these user groups. So a big thing for us was actually teaching threat modeling and sort of instilling threat modeling and understanding that there are a variety of different apps you can use. Some of the design recommendations we have, let's say with things like WhatsApp, is that it would be great to have much more granular disappearing messages. Could things like disappearing messages, perhaps be turned on by default? Granted, that would not work for a lot of users, but you could easily turn it off. By having, that was one of the biggest things we were sort of trying to get people to sort of normalize and think about, is perhaps our data actually should be somewhat more ephemeral if that is like a part of your threat model, if you are worried about things leaking. Another thing that we had also thought about was, different features we kind of take for, let's say, for granted, is, like we could think of these as link previews, things like stickers, other such things. Can we make some of those more easy to disable, for example? In our report, we have specific reasons in terms of why we recommend that. I recommend all of you look at that, for example. But moving away from this norm that is within, I would argue, big tech, that a lot of things are just standard and that's the way that they are and they can't necessarily be changed. Users need agency to be able to tailor different settings that they have that fit their exact needs. And we have to sort of move away from an assumption that we know what those needs are. One of our recommendations is that like all designers and developers, sort of regardless of where they are located, should be utilizing methodologies like design from the margins by Afsana Rigat from Article 19, and really designing for the most vulnerable first and thinking about that in particular as sort of the baseline. We liken this to curb cuts and disability and accessibility by design. When you design for the most marginalized, you're creating a safer product for everyone. We think about this also in terms of use case, let's say with things like online harassment. Anyone can face online harassment anywhere. And a lot of these pro-security, pro-privacy settings that would benefit, like the user groups we're working with, also benefit those facing things like online harassment. Another thing is just really considering how, especially for those that are working in encrypted messaging apps, how can we make a lot of them actually much more user-friendly? Do we need different things where maybe there's slightly more explanations? One of the things we were a big fan of was, we talked about this a lot, didn't end up in our report, but it's something internally our team talked quite a bit about, was how, for example, the Tor browser has like 3 different settings you can pick from if you're really new to encryption or privacy. And it's really based on like what you're worried about, right? And it's almost like a slider. Is that a kind of setting or feature we will need in the future? I think that that's like a way to start thinking forward, for example, within that. So what are ways in which there can be some of that little like lifting that can be done by the app itself? Another thing is maybe having normalized naming, like naming schemas and descriptions across apps, for example. One of the things we noticed again in Facebook Messenger and Telegram is that they called their encrypted messaging secure or private. Well, what does that mean to a user, right? What does like secret mean in that context? You know, does secure always mean encrypted? Another thing is thinking about, do we need, again, naming schemas or standards for different kinds of encryption that people are using, right? Should there be different names when you're using indent encrypted versus another kind? And part of that's really important if we're interested in building, let's say, a much more general literacy around what these names mean. So if it's differing product to product, how are users supposed to situate themselves within that, right? How are they supposed to understand how these things work without having to do a lot of research on their part? I think it's important that we keep that in mind, that users should not have to be security experts to use these everyday things in their lives. And this is something I think that we really do have to, again, sort of create, I don't know if standards is necessarily the right words, but normalization around when it comes to civil society research around encryption, and also how tech companies are engaging with this.
Perfect. Thanks, Caroline. And I think you pointed to the need for more clarity and specificity in terms of the use of terms or schemas like secure, encrypted, and the value in providing users with more choice, meaningful choice over their journey and their use of apps, and building that general literacy. And so we have a question in the chat actually for Robert, which Robert, if you're happy to take, I will hand over to you. The question is, if we start with an assumption that barring encryption is off limits, can redesign in other tech areas improve people's ability to manage their online safety? And that point also applies to Caroline's about user agency design and designing perhaps from the margins. Robert, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, building on some of the points Caroline made, as well as I think both of our commitment to approach this as designers. It's a great question. And we do believe, and in our work, surfaced and prototyped and tested some approaches that could sit outside that envelope, but still help people very much, not just sort of secure their safety, but assess risk. That's what people want. They want to understand the risk of what they're going into. I don't think that we felt that people expected these platforms to be riskless, and they don't expect that encryption is going to make them safe. So one of the principles that came through was trying, we don't have that much faith. I don't have that much faith as a designer in settings. I think settings are great, but I don't think that's where people feel risk and where people want to address risk. So part of it is finding moments when people are engaging to create those moments of awareness and provide them with feedback. And so a couple that we looked at, one was when you get a group invite. It's a very important moment where people are trying to understand what it means to join that group, what it might mean to leave that group, because that's a point of high vulnerability. And what is the state of the group now and how that state might change. And so that's one point where people felt that they didn't have enough feedback before they chose to join a group. So that was a good example of a place where I think that there is a lot of design opportunity. Another is when people choose to make a change, like upload a new profile picture. It's a great opportunity for people, not because they're coming in with a high degree of risk in mind, because those moments are very hard for people cognitively to start to adopt new behaviors, but at that moment, who and how do they want that photo to be used? So there are things like that in everyday interactions that I think are critical. The second is, I think, and this is where the burden falls on the platform providers, is a lot more clarity on what recourse does and doesn't look like, and how you can address the risks and concerns you have in a way that doesn't make you more vulnerable. And I think that's the big problem, is that people feel like the mechanisms available to them today make them more vulnerable, not less, in the situation. Sure, if you flag somebody and that person's thrown off the app, you're making the world a lot better for a lot of people. But in that moment, you feel high risk. And it is very hard to sort of assure people that if you flag that issue or that person or that message, that somehow that won't get found out. So I do think those are some of the areas where we saw some significant design opportunities, and frankly, where I think the platform providers are kind of being a bit lazy in how they think about their role and responsibility. So I hope that answers the question, but those are some more concrete examples as well.
Thanks, Robert. And I think some of these points are speaking to the need for that iterative dialogue between platforms with the designers and users to ensure that that these platforms and apps are actually user-centric. And one area where we hear a lot about how that is done is of course user reporting. So I wanted to come to Diana about that, because it's often seen as one of the areas where perhaps there could be more solutions from providers of these services to support children in their safe and secure use of these apps. How did your research find anything that you'd like to bring to light on user reporting by children?
Yes, thank you very much, Sheetal. So one of the principles of a children's rights approach to encryption is that children must have access to justice for all violations of their rights in the digital environment. And as part of this right of access to justice, we put that confidential, safe, and child-friendly user reporting, because Caroline was referring to user-friendly, in this case, child-friendly user reporting tools should be made available to ensure that children are able to report material, to report behavior on the services that they use. And this would go some way in counteracting the narrative that Robin, thank you very much, was putting in the chat about children as objects of protection. So it would be a way to empower children. But what we found in our research is that, yes, user reporting can be implemented without posing risks to privacy and security in encrypted environments. And in some ways, in such a polarized debate as that of encryption and children, user reporting is one of the areas where consensus can be reached. At the same time, user reports really need adequate and timely responses from platforms. So what we found in our conversations with participants, including survivors of child sexual abuse, was that they did not trust the platform to act quickly on the report. So this is definitely something that needs to be remedied, both in the way that platforms deal with it as a substance and also in the messaging, because what we found from industry, from our conversations with industry, was that they felt that they were doing quite a lot. So there is this kind of lack of consistency between the messaging and how child users and especially survivors of child sexual abuse perceive the usefulness of user reporting.
That's really interesting, Diana. And I think you spoke to a point that has come up in our discussion so far a few times, which is around trust, and this reality that there isn't really actually much trust, and there are creative and different ways that users find, particularly vulnerable users, to deal with that, but that we need to be aware of that, and even if there isn't ever going to be that 100% trust, that there is an obligation really to ensure that messaging is secure, and that the misconceptions that vulnerable users might have as well are addressed in design and in the services are provided. So I think there's been a lot there that we have been able hopefully to digest, and I'll do a couple of takeaways from this. But I wanted to come to our panelists before we wrap up, just in case there's anything in particular you want to highlight, perhaps one recommendation that you would like to see taken forward in particular from the research that you've done. Shall we start? We could start with any of you, but Caroline, we start with you, and then Robert, and then Diana. Thank you.
Sorry, just pulling up my notes. I think, oh my gosh, like where to start? I mean, I think it's important for policymakers in particular to stand like on the side of encryption and stop trying to pass different bills that would like weaken encryption, sort of regardless of what they think that those bills would be achieving. I do think a lot of this, again, really comes back to when I think about the specific groups we were working with. You know, our recommendations are, again, very explicitly tailored to those groups. They are not like general recommendations. They are recommendations for developers who are working on messaging apps, thinking about what these two groups are facing, which is jail time, which is criminalization, right? Which is threats from two different, very, very different state governments. And so within that, it's incredibly important that those developers be adopting privacy by design approaches and investing more and more time deliberately working with users from these vulnerable, marginalized communities that, you know, as I mentioned earlier, that these apps be much more user-friendly, that applications need to have encryption, that they should be turned on by default. One of the things that we were worried about is the danger of feature creep. So in certain apps, let's say like Facebook Messenger and Telegram, that there are so many features, like so many different kinds of features that seem pro-privacy, but they're all turned on the most public way possible, then eroding one's privacy. And so one of the things that's really important is developers need to sort of strike this balance between, is this a messaging app or like a mid-sized social network, right? And I think actually recognizing that those are two different kinds of things. And I know that this sounds counterintuitive to making features for users, but there is a balance between too much, right, and too little. I think those are some of the main, I think really some of the main things. And then thinking about really the logic and placement of where those buttons or tools are. One of the things we noticed that WhatsApp had introduced while we were doing our report was in large groups or just in groups in general, that you can turn on disappearing messages, which is great, but then that people can keep messages, and that the keep feature was very, very broken. We tested this with 3 different devices in 3 different countries. It was not consistent in notifying in our testing that a message had been kept, right? That's a security issue. That's a security flaw. You can see potentially why there would be a use in that, but it's something where the actual sort of safety elements and mechanisms were not properly functioning. So one could argue or ask, like, well, then why have that? And I will say that, you know, you can take screenshots and that doesn't necessarily stop that, but it is something, again, to think about when little things are introduced. Are users aware of how those small things actually can subvert their safety?
Absolutely, lots there. Thank you for that, Caroline. Robert, any last words?
Yeah, just to recognize this is not a technical problem. It's not being solved simply through a technical solution like encryption. And so coming back to Caroline's point, it's a design problem, and bringing people, designers, users together in a more open way, being a little less reliant on the data flowing through your platform to tell you what you're missing, and to invest in that dialogue, and for policymakers to make that a requirement, that dialogue happen in a more transparent way between platforms and the users and other stakeholders who are so dependent on them now, whether that's businesses or others. So I think there's a lot of room for policymakers to nudge that forward. And I think we have to move beyond a dialogue where we're just digging in on the technical kind of element of encryption as like the most important thing to stand behind, and instead thinking about trust a little more broadly, and how does encryption help us set the stage for a more productive dialogue.
Absolutely, how encryption is part of that bigger picture. Thank you. Diana?
Thank you very much. I think I have one point, and it links to what Robert was saying. So in this bringing people together and creating a dialogue, I would really stress the need to include children's voices, both on the policy side and in design. So, for example, we've seen that the debate on encryption and children is very polarized. But again, one thing that people from different backgrounds can probably agree on is that there is a serious lack of data regarding children's voices. in the case of design, in the case of policy proposals, and that often stakeholders speak for young people rather than hearing them in the development of policy or design on encryption. So children's views should be given due weight, and that could happen, for example, by child-led design, by youth co-design, and by listening to them in policy proposals.
Wonderful. Thanks, Diana. And we are at the end now. So I wanted to perhaps just end on that call to action, really, which is around ensuring that the design of encrypted, secure private messaging apps is user-centric, and that there is that dialogue. There's a role for policymakers there. There's a role for designers. There's a role for us all. And there's a lot of nuance, a lot of recommendations that has come through the research that you've done. And I think we will hopefully be building on that in the future. Thank you for bringing some of that nuance and complexity to the debate today. I hope that everyone has taken something from it. I wanted to thank you, all the panelists, for being here, for sharing the research, and also to all the participants who have engaged. In fact, with the entire summit today, this is the last panel of the day, and I hope you found it as engaging and as informative as I have. Please do visit the Global Encryption Coalition website to discover more activities related to Global Encryption Day. And let's continue to work for and to strengthen strong encryption for everyone. Thank you again, and I hope to see you all soon.
Thanks so much. Take care.